No, your comments indicated already a kind of answer. Poland was very active in trying to build a balanced structure at the periphery of the existing European Union. Well, the problem is that Russia is in a process of growing itself, of reassessing its own objectives. You remember at the beginning of the 90s, the theory of the close neighborhood, or there were several circles presented as being under a certain influence of Russia. And they indicated first the former members of Soviet Union, and then the countries which were previously members of Comecon and the Warsaw Treaty. Well, Russia, under the pressure of events, had to concentrate on itself for almost 2 decades. Now, by the fact that the world is now on transition from the unipolar model to a multipolar world, Russia tries to get a new position as a global power. That's why becoming a kind of arbiter, of a judge in the end, in the Syrian conflict, helped Russia to assert itself a new level of global power. It is clear that Russia looks at the Eastern Partnership as a kind of invasion of its own area of influence. Until now, it was not so much in a position to react. The problem is that Russia can use some very specific tools against some of those countries in the Eastern Partnership. It was clear with Ukraine, with Moldova, and even with Belarus. But exactly, yeah. So it is obvious that Russia wants to avoid a policy of containment for Russia. Well, the Eastern Partnership is a revival of the Truman doctrine of containment, entering into its own house and trying to close some of the windows and doors. That's why I think the process will be very difficult. And I hope it will not be used, the Eastern Partnership will not be used as a as an element of negotiation in a package with other topics by Eastern Europe, by the European Union. There are many topics under discussion with Russia, and I don't think that this is on a priority list. That's why, as it was mentioned, France, Italy, Spain, Germany are not very keen to advance too rapidly, at least, the outcome of the Vilnius summit. That's why I said that I don't have huge expectations on the outcome. We'll see. It's a bargaining chip, in my opinion. There are other subjects which are more important. And the weakness of the European Union is that the foreign policy of the European Union is not yet well established. You have particular policies from various capitals directly with Moscow, expressing different kind of interests. Berlin, Paris, especially. You don't have Brussels to Moscow. And perhaps it is under construction, and perhaps it will, the foreign policy, common foreign policy, will become a reality in the next years. That's why I said that I said at the beginning that the Eastern Partnership is on the menu, but not on the suggested plates. It is something which can be advanced or not, depending on the circumstances. Anyway, for Russia, it's something essential, and if they will have the resources to respond, to give certain benefits, to offer things to some of those countries, they will continue to do. Because it is clear that they want to offer much more. It is a game in which they want to attract to attract as much as possible from the initial 6. They have done so far, and they will continue to do. On the other side, the countries, the 6 members, are now negotiating with both sides, trying to get as much as possible. And so this is an interesting period of time. The countries themselves are the target, but at the same time, they are the actors of the negotiation process. We'll see in Vilnius what will happen.
Hoping for an ambitious text of the final declaration.
Well, the roadmap was very ambitious. I went through it, and I have seen huge promises, but they do not compare with what the Russians offered in a very concrete way.
Or threatened. They offer some advantages, but from the other hand, they may threaten to.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. But they try to. Well, the word is perhaps too strong, to blackmail. But the blackmail could not be successful if the European Union understand that they can offer as a counterbalance, some other advantages. So, as it happened with the wine exports from Moldova, when they have been banned to Russia, they could be exported to the European Union. So, if you have a quick reaction from the European Union, in those cases, of course, the type of decisions taken in Moscow to block some of the potential trade with those countries will lose, well, the threatening effect. Other comments? Yeah.
I know that you are not only a diplomat, but you also graduated sociology. So my next question,
well, I will try to write a book on that subject because exactly, and the clash of civilizations, and to see with Huntington how we can rebuild the new society. Well, becoming more cynical, I'm not so much interested in ideology. Ideology, unfortunately, during the 20th century was a clear tool of manipulation. And if you look to what happened in well, after the Cold War, you will see that the governments formed in the East, but also in the West, have lost the ideological identity. The governmental policies are based on IMF constraints, macroeconomic constraints. You have 4, 5, 6 essential elements. So it's difficult to say if a government is the right wing or left wing. You have a combination of social liberal attitudes, dimensions. So if you look, perhaps what I'm saying is more true for Romania, but I dare to say that in other Eastern countries it happened the same way. You might argue that in France the new regime is very leftist, and where the measures on taxation and others are very clear left-wing oriented. Not for long. After 1 year, they discovered that this created a huge problem for the support, for the public support. Going back to your question, whether Tony Blair was right with the third way, with the social liberal ideology, with a kind of combination between left and right values. I'm not so sure. Anyway, this if you go back to what happened in Germany during Gerhard Schröder's time, you will see that his reforms were much more right-wing oriented in terms of pensions, in terms of economic reforms. That's why, well, he has lost the public support, but he is now considered the big hero of the economic reform, not only in Germany but also by the French. If you look to Great Britain, Tony Blair lost his support not because of his compromises, but because of the way he handled the involvement in the second Iraqi war. In France, they tried with Lionel Jospin, but they didn't succeed so much because they have the same strange model regime, presidential regime, like in Romania, semi-presidential regime. And he was blocked by President Chirac in some of his objectives. Now, trying to respond in conceptual terms, the West emphasized a number of values which have been contained mainly in the Statute of the Council of Europe, and which have been afterwards included in the preamble of the European Union. It's very interesting that the falling apart of the Soviet regime and the communist regime was not generated by the arms race, was not generated by cruise or Pershing rockets, missiles. It's very interesting to see that after 1975, after the Helsinki Final Act, small viruses, the human rights, the concepts, generated the implosion of the communist regime. Are human rights part of Western ideology or of capitalistic? Yes and no at the same time. They are considered as being universal. But it's very strange to see that instead of having a universal conception, those elements are developing only in a microsystem which represents a regional organization, and then exported outside. One example: various NGOs before '89 used to send books to Eastern countries, to you, to him, whatever. The books were censored at the custom. They never reached the destinary. But, in a way or another, they arrived in various libraries to various people from the political elite. The NGOs didn't care about the final destinary of the book, but those books explaining a way of life, supporting different types of values were included in the education and the culture of the communist regime. And in this way, after some time, with the humanitarian exchanges, well, the system in Soviet Union mainly, but also in other countries of the Eastern Bloc, collapsed. Collapsed, and it's very interesting as a mechanism. You remember the concepts of Gorbachev, glasnost, perestroika. Those concepts came under the pressure of a certain pressure from those values connected with human rights. I wrote a book in 1992. I published a book called Human Rights, Religion of the End of the Century. Because human rights became, at that time, more than ideology, a religion. And in the name of that religion, a lot of things have been advocated as being necessary. Now you have other symbols, not so much human rights, but you have the state of law. Well, all the time you have different types of symbols which sometimes cover very specific interests. I don't want to enter into further details about the humanitarian interventions from what happened at the beginning of 20th century, China, but also what happened later on in the name of human rights in Africa or on other territories. It's clear that ideology can be something genuine or a tool for manipulation. Now, everywhere we can see that instead of ideological values, we have what is called pragmatism, pragmatic approach. In the governments, in the political parties, on their doctrines, you can see several lines on ideology. But once they enter in government, you have the IMF ideology, you have the World Bank ideology, you have the automatic pilot from Brussels, you have the 3% budget deficit, you have a lot of other elements which are not really ideological. They have very clear economic, political, strategic background. So I answered in this way because if I had a good answer, I would have been very short. Yes, please. I have a problem being a lawyer. International law starts from a fiction, a legal fiction, that all states are equal. The reality
But some are more equal than one. When you compare.
In reality, as Orwell would have said, some of the countries are more equal than others. And if you look at the American universities, you won't find many courses on international law. You will see a lot of courses on balance of power, or the use or non-use of force, international relations, whatever. Not international law. Because when you apply principles of international law deriving from the equality and rights, you will have to accept with some exceptions that all countries have one vote in an international organization or an equal say on international matters. That's why the United Nations is an organization which functioned in a romantic way some years after the Second World War. Later on, the activity concentrated on the Security Council and the veto right of the permanent members. The veto right demonstrated that the power still represents an important element in an international arena. When you talk about reciprocity, you have to think about the force, about the real power of the counterparts. Well, European Union didn't decide yet to have one voice with Russia. And that's why Russia, in a very wise way, avoided having a clear one way of communication with Brussels, but preferred to have different channels of communication with various capitals of the members. Because in this way, they could negotiate in a very specific way the interests they had. And that's why, with France concerning some of the interests of France in Africa, with Germany, some interests connected with Gazprom, and some elements on the Baltic area or Ukraine. So the package of negotiation was different. But that's why when you ask about reciprocity, you have to be aware that at this time there is not a clear will of negotiating in common, in Brussels I mean, with Russia. Because there is not a perception of common interests. Some of the countries in member states have interest in importing oil or gas from Russia, some others don't. Some of the countries in the southern part of Europe import gas from Northern Africa. There are huge differences in economic and political interest. That's why it's not yet possible to have a clear negotiation with reciprocity. I don't mean in terms of retaliation, but in terms of discussing various interests of the countries. Russia might have difficulty in keeping the borders towards European Union territory, and after the retreat of the Americans from Afghanistan, the territory of Russia might become a place where terrorist organizations might develop. Also, smuggling might develop, drug trafficking. So there are prospects of complicated issues, especially in Asia, after the retreat of the Americans from Afghanistan. And those developments might affect also the eastern border of Eastern Europe, in a way or another. So there is also a common interest of Russia and the European Union in dealing with some issues. It's not only a clash of interests. There are also common interests which should be discussed. But at this time, connected with Eastern Partnership, it's clear that there are more the divergent interests which are fighting each other prior to Vilnius, and, in my opinion, also after Vilnius.
His Excellency, because you mentioned Afghanistan, can you tell us your opinion about the relation between the European Union and NATO? Even if it's not our topic today, but you mentioned Afghanistan and also Russian Federation, and next year the developments in Afghanistan because of the NATO troops.